In the lonely, haunted forests of Romania, a small region was in crisis. It was torn from within by ambitious, treacherous nobles and threatened from without by the mighty Ottoman war machine. But one man would eliminate his rivals, secure the state, and inflict devastating losses on the Ottoman invaders. Today we will learn about one of Europe's most famous and ruthless leaders. A man so ruthless, his favourite method of dealing with his enemies became his nickname, Vlad the Impaler. This is Knowledge Voyage. Picture the scene. In the magnificent setting of the Turkish Sultan's palace are two young brothers. Sent by their Romanian father as hostages, they will spend 5 years being abused and witnessing many acts of cruelty against palace prisoners. One of these brothers would become loyal to the Ottomans, converting to Islam and fighting in their army, but the other brother followed a very different path. When he finally returned to his native Romania, he was filled with rage, resentment, and a desire to never again be at someone else's mercy. His name was Vlad. Vlad and his brother Radu had been sent to the Ottoman palace by their father, Vlad Sr., who believed placing his sons at the mercy of the Sultan would dissuade him from wanting to invade his lands. The boys' lives were expendable in the eyes of their father. Vlad Sr. was the ruler of Wallachia in modern Romania, and he had recently been initiated into the Order of the Dragon. The Romanian word for dragon is Dracul, and in Romanian, a letter A is added to words to show belonging, so the son of Dracul was Dracula. The word Dracul in Romanian can mean both dragon and devil. And in the case of Vlad Jr., his anger from years of abandonment, abuse and captivity would see many people view him as both a dragon and a devil. Wallachia was a scary place. Locals told stories of the Strogoi, ghostly beings that preyed on the living by seducing them. The Moroni shapeshifters also haunted the woods, and werewolves known as Varcolaki were said to prowl the woods. The 1400s had also seen a spread of the Bogomil heresy in Romania, and that heresy taught that Satan had fathered a child with Eve in the Garden of Eden. In short, it was a scary and superstitious place, and this didn't help the many nobles who jostled for position and were happy to use fear to subdue their population. But Vlad would become the supreme tactician when it came to fear. But Vlad's father was murdered by rival nobles, and Vlad Jr. fled to his uncle's castle, where he had another 2 years to brood and plot revenge, and one day that anger would explode. Years later, Vlad returned to Wallachia. He invited a group of nobles to a banquet under the cover of a meal for peace. After serving cabbages, he waited to tell them until they were finished that the cabbages had been grown in a garden where the severed heads of their friends had been used as fertilizer. He then ordered the nobles dragged to the courtyard and impaled on long sharp sticks one after the other. Vlad then calmly sat amongst the twitching and screaming victims on the poles to finish his meal. A small number were spared and forced to work as slave labourers, building Vlad a new fortress at Puanari. One account states the slaves were worked in all weathers until their clothes rotted off their backs and fell off before they died. Vlad had crushed the nobles who betrayed his father and threatened him, and now he set off to terrorise the local civilians into obedience. He started with monks. He asked 2 monks if he was justified in impaling the nobles. One monk said yes, as they had been disloyal, but the other monk said it was wrong to impale them. Vlad then asked the second monk why someone as stupid as him was outside of the monastery, and had the monk impaled. The willingness to kill a cleric was a shocking display in a deeply religious medieval Europe. But Vlad was only getting started. He launched ruthless attacks on Romania's German minority, pitilessly burning and looting their settlements in towns like Brasov and impaling thousands of people. The Germans were Catholic and loyal to the Pope, and Vlad aimed to utterly brutalise them to make clear that he was the only boss. German monks fled west to Europe with tales of his cruelty. As one German chronicle says, quote, "In the year of our Lord 1456, Dracula did many dreadful and curious things." Vlad was obsessed with internal control and set up an internal secret service to spy on the locals and keep an eye out for plots. Vlad was determined to stamp out even minor crime using the cruelest methods. On one occasion, Vlad caught a gypsy thief and asked the gypsies if they would hang him. When they replied they would not, he agreed not to hang him. So instead, the man was boiled to death and the rest of his family were then forced to eat him. Vlad was obsessed with honesty and obedience in others, and would often test travellers and merchants. When a merchant brought his wagon of 160 ducats of gold to Wallachia, Vlad had the treasure stolen and hidden. He then allowed the merchant to stay with him whilst a, quote, search was launched. At a later date, Vlad told the merchant the gold had been found, but Vlad had placed just a single extra gold ducat in the wagon. Vlad then asked the merchant if the gold was all there, and the merchant bashfully explained that there seemed to be more gold than was in his treasure originally. This display of honesty hugely impressed Vlad, and he sent the merchant on his way, but not before reminding him that had he tried to deceive him and not report the single extra ducat, he would have been impaled without a second thought. The terror Vlad spread sent shockwaves through the land, and it is said people were so afraid of being impaled that a gold cup Vlad left by a drinking fountain was never stolen, despite its value. Vlad may have eliminated internal threats and cowed his population into submission, but there was a threat forming on his borders he could not ignore. That threat was the mighty Ottoman Empire. Just a few years earlier, Ottomans had captured Constantinople, stomping out the last embers of the Roman Empire. The Ottomans, with their belief in a divine right to conquer and subjugate non-believers, had seen them ruthlessly rule through the Balkans, and Vlad's Wallachia was in their bullseye. Vlad's father had been happy to kowtow to the Sultan in exchange for peace. However, Vlad the Impaler was in no mood to obey the Sultan. The Sultan sent his ambassadors to Vlad's palace to demand submission. On entering his throne room, they refused to remove their turbans. Vlad was furious as he ordered all visitors to remove their hats in his presence. When the Ottomans explained they could not remove the turbans because of their custom, he said he had a way of helping them keep that custom. The ambassadors were then dragged away and had their turbans nailed to their heads. When news of this got back to the Ottomans, they decided to lure Vlad to the palace at Giurgiu and assassinate him. But unknown to the Turks, Vlad's secret service had tipped him off about the plot, and Vlad was ready to outthink them. Vlad went to Giurgiu with a group of troops all disguised in Turkish-style armour. The gatekeepers, expecting a large Turkish force to arrive and lie in wait for Vlad, opened the gates. But once inside, Vlad's forces revealed themselves and slaughtered the garrison, as Giurgiu was set on fire. The Sultan was incandescent with rage, but what he didn't realise was it was all part of Vlad's plan. Uniquely amongst Europeans, Vlad knew Sultan Mehmet personally, having spent time with him as a teenager at the Ottoman royal palace. Vlad had come to know the Sultan, including how to goad and needle him into overreacting. Vlad knew the Sultan could not allow the brutalisation of his ambassadors and the burning of Giurgiu garrison to go unanswered. The Sultan then sent a huge invasion force across the Danube into the land of Transylvania. Among them was Radu, Vlad's Muslim convert brother, and a huge force of elite Janissary troops, cavalry, and infantry from across the empire. The Turks outnumbered Vlad's troops 3-1 and were confident of success, but they had never fought someone quite like Vlad before, and they were about to find that out. Vlad decided to use the thick forests as cover for his forces. As Ottoman troops sweltered in the summer heat, Vlad's troops sheltered in the cool forests. Vlad's forces would strike at the rear of the Ottoman marching columns, killing troops then melting away at rapid speed into the thick forests. The Turkish troops were badly rattled by this. The troops all knew of the legends of Transylvania's haunted forests, filled with ghosts, ghouls, werewolves, and of course, vampires. They were in no mood to enter the forests and look for Vlad's troops, in case they ended up victims to the supernatural horrors within. To add to their fear, Vlad left impaled and castrated Ottoman troops on stakes along roads he knew the Ottoman army would have to march along. After weeks of guerrilla warfare, Vlad was ready for his boldest ever attack, and that attack was a direct attempt on the life of the Sultan in his camp tent. The Ottoman camp was set up, and Vlad himself infiltrated the camp, disguised as an Ottoman soldier. The Ottoman army was multi-ethnic, so a Balkan-looking man in Turkish armour would not have elicited much suspicion. Vlad wandered through the camp in disguise until he found the Sultan's tent. After making a note of where it was, he withdrew, rejoined his troops, and waited. The Ottoman army performed their Muslim prayers at sunset, and once the prayers had ended and darkness fell, the troops retired to bed. And now, Vlad struck. His troops stormed in under cover of darkness and began slashing and stabbing the sleeping Turkish troops. Soon screams and alarmed cries tore through the air, and one scream was particularly unsettling, and that was the Turkish phrase, Kazıklı Bey, Impaler Prince. Those cries put the Turkish camp in a panic, as the most feared guerrilla leader who had been brutalising their troops was now believed to be using supernatural forces to enter their camp at night. Vlad was unable to find the Sultan's tent in the dark, and one can only imagine the shockwaves that would have been sent had a Sultan been killed in the middle of an armed camp by an intruder. The Turkish troops regrouped in the morning, counted their losses, and set off towards Târgoviște, and it was on this road they saw a final sight that would convince them it was time to go home. As they drew closer, they heard low moaning, screaming, and weeping in the distance, and as the Turkish army turned the corner, they saw a horrifying sight, and that was 20,000 people impaled on sticks, many of them still alive. The Turkish chroniclers stated that at this point, the Sultan asked in disbelief how it was possible to fight and conquer a man as cruel as Vlad. The Turkish Sultan had seen enough, and the army went home. Vlad had stood up to the most powerful army in the world at the time and sent it packing. Throughout Europe, Christians celebrated. On roads, Te Deum church bells rung in celebration, and prayers were said to the glory of the Romanian prince. However, it was a bittersweet triumph. During the conflict, Dracula's lover feared she would be captured by the Turks. Rather than be taken alive, she leapt to her death from a high tower into the river. The river is still known as the Riul Doamnei, or Princess's River in Romanian. Vlad's luck would finally run out when he was captured by Hungarian ruler Matthias Corvinus, who held him as a prisoner in the freezing damp dungeons under Buda Castle in Budapest. The dungeons are still there, and well worth a visit and are said to be haunted. During these 10 years of captivity, Vlad is said to have impaled mice on sticks, and has occasionally wheeled out at banquets so Corvinus could awe and impress his guests with one of Europe's most feared men. Vlad was eventually released and went back to become the ruler of Wallachia for a third and final time. It is unclear exactly how he died, but it is widely believed he was assassinated, possibly on Turkish orders. Tradition holds that Vlad's head was severed and taken to the Sultan's palace in Constantinople. The head was displayed in the city as proof one of the most feared enemies of the Ottoman Empire was really dead. If you ever visit Romania, Vlad's castle is still in Bran, and it's a popular tourist attraction with a commanding view of the surrounding Transylvanian countryside. It remained a royal residence until the 1940s. Vlad would become famous in the West centuries later. Irish writer Bram Stoker was looking for a setting for his vampire-themed book, and was advised to read the book The Land Beyond the Forest by a Hungarian friend, and this fired his imagination to set the tale in the land beyond the forest, or in Romanian, the Transilvanii. Vlad the Impaler continues to enjoy a sinister reputation in the West as a psychopath who cruelly impaled and tortured his victims. But in Romania, he is often viewed as a hero who secured order to a divided society, stood up to powerful regional enemies, and inflicted a stunning defeat on the world's strongest army. Vlad may have been brutal, but one thing is sure. It will be some time before the name of Vlad the Impaler, son of the devil, will ever be forgotten. Thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Thank you.